Sit back, relax, and let us dive into a story that will challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the hidden masks people wear in a world obsessed with wealth. In the bustling, chaotic, and unforgiving city of Asaba, the glittering lights of high society skyscrapers stand in stark, brutal contrast to the sprawling, dusty alleyways where the forgotten souls of the city struggle daily just to survive. It is a place where a person's worth is far too often measured solely by the thickness of their wallet, the brand of their car, or the prestige of their family name. In this deeply divided world, where social inequality gapes like an open wound, we find our protagonist, Dazebo. To anyone working alongside him in the cramped, poorly ventilated corporate office where he spends his days, Dazebo is nothing more than a quiet, remarkably humble, and intensely hardworking low-level clerk. He is the kind of man who dresses in faded, neatly ironed shirts, carries his lunch in a simple plastic container, and walks with his head down, carefully avoiding the arrogant gazes of his superiors. He speaks only when spoken to, works late into the night without a single word of complaint, and lives so modestly that he seems entirely invisible to the ambitious social climbers surrounding him. But Dazebo carries a secret so massive, a truth so heavy, that it consumes his thoughts every single second of the day. He is not the impoverished, struggling orphan his coworkers believe him to be. In reality, Dazebo is the only son and sole heir of Mr. Jabba, an extraordinarily wealthy titan of industry whose multi-million-dollar business empire stretches across several major cities, operating from a breathtakingly luxurious mansion in the elite district of Buguma. Dazebo has signed deals that altered the financial landscape of entire regions. He has stood unblinking before ruthless international businessmen. He has access to an unimaginable fortune that could buy the very building he quietly cleans and works in every day. Yet he chose to strip away his expensive, tailored suits, leave his luxury vehicles behind, and bury his true identity deep beneath the soil of this exhausting lie. This radical choice was born from a place of profound, shattering heartbreak. Not long ago, Dazebo had been prepared to marry a woman he loved with every fiber of his being, a woman he believed valued his soul above all else. But the moment a sudden, calculated financial crisis threatened his family's standing, her beautiful mask slipped away, revealing a cold, calculating opportunist who vanished the second the money seemed to fade. Broken, disillusioned, and entirely robbed of his faith in human sincerity, Dazebo had retreated into despair, realizing that his wealth was a golden cage that made it impossible to know who truly loved him for the man he was, rather than the empire he inherited. Seeing his son's spirit slowly wither, the wise and formidable Mr. Jabba had sat him down and proposed a desperate, unconventional experiment. The older man suggested that Dazebo strip away every single trace of his affluence, move to a completely different city where nobody knew his face, and live the grueling life of an ordinary low-wage worker. Only by removing money entirely from the picture could he ever hope to find a soul whose affection was pure, untainted by greed, and fiercely loyal. And so, the billionaire's son became a forgotten clerk, enduring the subtle scorns of society, all in the desperate hope of finding a love that was real. For months, this secret experiment felt like a bleak, repetitive, deeply discouraging cycle that only reinforced Dazebo's cynicism. In his quest to find a genuine partner, he had carefully initiated relationships with a few women over the past year, always maintaining his facade of poverty. But human nature, wrapped in the tight grip of materialism, disappointed him time and time again. He had established a strict, ultimate test of devotion. After gaining a woman's initial affection, he would invite her to a deeply impoverished, dilapidated property he had secured in the poorest, most neglected slum of Asaba. Claiming it was his only home, the results were universally devastating. The moment these women stepped onto the rough, unpaved roads of that neighborhood, their smiles would instantly freeze. The very second they stood before the cracked, decaying walls of that tiny, miserable shack, their eyes would fill with a mixture of intense disgust and profound disappointment. Some would suddenly check their phones, fabricate a frantic emergency, and flee within minutes, never answering his calls again. Others would manage to stay for a tense, polite hour only to become completely distant over the next few days, gradually fading out of his life like ghosts escaping a graveyard of failed expectations. None of them possessed the depth of character to look past the illusion of poverty. None of them stayed long enough to see the beautiful, noble, and fiercely protective man standing right behind the heavy curtain of destitution. Gazebo's heart had grown cold, calcified by the bitter realization that everyone had a price, and that without his family's millions, he was utterly worthless in the eyes of the world. He began to believe that he was destined to live a life of profound isolation, surrounded by luxury, but completely starved of authentic human connection. But just as he was prepared to abandon the experiment entirely, pack his bags, and return to the empty opulence of Buguma, everything changed. Like a sudden, brilliant ray of golden sunlight piercing through a heavy storm, Tama walked into his life, and the fragile foundations of his carefully constructed world began to tremble. Tama was a breath of fresh air in that suffocating, highly competitive corporate environment. She was an exceptionally beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent woman who worked in the same department. Yet she possessed a rare, deeply rooted grace that set her completely apart from the cruel, status-obsessed people in the office. While others spent their lunch breaks gossiping about promotions, designer clothes, and wealthy suitors, Tama could be found sharing her food with the office cleaners, speaking with genuine kindness to everyone, regardless of their rank, focusing entirely on her duties with an inspiring, quiet dignity. She was a woman of profound substance, someone who valued honesty, hard work, and the silent strength of a person's character far above any material possessions. From the very moment she arrived, Gazebo found himself utterly captivated by her. Unlike the others, who treated Gazebo like an invisible fixture or an inconvenient obstacle, Tama noticed him immediately. She saw the meticulous care he put into his work, the gentle patience with which he helped others, and the quiet, humble nobility that shone through his simple clothes. Slowly, effortlessly, a beautiful bond began to form between them. What started as polite morning greetings quickly evolved into shared lunch breaks outside the company building, where they would sit away from the prying eyes of their judgmental coworkers, lost in deep, meaningful conversations that lasted until the final bell rang. They talked about their childhood dreams, their deepest fears, and the simple joys of life. For the first time in years, Gazebo felt a profound, exhilarating sense of peace. When he looked into Tama's warm, expressive eyes, he did not see the predatory glint of greed or the calculated assessment of his financial worth. He saw a pure, beautiful soul that genuinely enjoyed his company. He loved her with an intensity that terrified him, an emotional devotion that grew stronger with each passing day. Yet, even as their hearts beat in perfect synchronization, the massive, dark shadow of his deception loomed heavily over them, threatening to destroy the fragile paradise they were building. Tama had asked him multiple times, with innocent curiosity, where he lived, wanting to understand his world completely. But every single time the question arose, Gazebo would feel a sharp stab of panic, his smile would falter, and he would quickly, clumsily change the topic, leaving Tama with a growing, unsettling sense that the man she was falling for was harboring a deeply hidden truth. Now, on this quiet, heavily humid evening in Asaba, the long-dreaded moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Gazebo walked slowly down a poor, incredibly narrow street, his footsteps heavy with an overwhelming anxiety that threatened to suffocate him. Beside him walked Tama, her elegant presence looking entirely out of place in this dark, neglected corner of the city. The area was eerily quiet, the unpaved road was severely rough and broken, filled with deep potholes and muddy puddles that reflected the dim, dying light of the setting sun. On either side of them, old, neglected houses with heavily rusted zinc roofs stood tightly packed together, leaning against one another like frail, exhausted old men. It was the absolute epitome of urban poverty, the kind of forgotten, dangerous neighborhood where only the deeply desperate and those completely crushed by financial hardship lived. Tama looked around slowly, her brows furrowed in a mixture of intense confusion and profound surprise. This was completely different from the comfortable, modest life she had imagined Gazebo lived. She had always known he was a simple man who avoided luxury, but she had never envisioned him trapped in a place this bleak, this completely severed from decent living conditions. As they walked together in a tense, heavy silence, the air thick with unsaid words, Tama could feel her intuition screaming. She sensed with absolute certainty that the mysterious curtain Gazebo had drawn around his private life was finally about to be ripped open, and that the ultimate truth was about to reveal itself. Gazebo glanced at her briefly, his eyes wide with a raw, hidden terror before he quickly looked away, staring fixedly at the dirt path ahead. His heart was hammering violently against his ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm that echoed loudly in his ears. He had faced down powerful, cutthroat businessmen in boardroom battles without a single tremor of fear. He had signed monumental corporate deals worth millions of dollars without a single moment of hesitation. But this exact moment, standing on a dirt road in a forgotten slum, made him more profoundly nervous than he had ever been in his entire life. Because this moment was not about business, commerce, or financial dominance. This moment was entirely about his heart. This was the terrifying absolute crucible that would finally tell him whether Tama truly, unconditionally loved him for the man he was, or whether she would turn her back on him, her face twisted in disgust, and walk away forever, leaving his soul permanently shattered like all the selfish, deceptive women who had walked this exact path before her. Gazebo abruptly stopped walking, his entire body rigid with tension. Tama stopped too, turning her gaze from the bleak surroundings to look directly at him, her heart heavy with an indefinable dread. They were standing directly in front of a small, shockingly old building that seemed to actively defy gravity just by remaining upright. The structure looked incomparably poor, a painful monument to human neglect. The roof was entirely covered with old, deeply corroded, rusty zinc sheets that groaned softly in the evening breeze. Some parts of the metal were severely bent, torn, and entirely worn out, making it completely obvious that during the heavy tropical rainy season, torrential water would leak relentlessly through several massive gaps, flooding the tiny interior. Wild, aggressive green grasses had grown terrifyingly tall all around the small, neglected compound, creating a thick, untidy jungle that crept up the sides of the walls. The weeds were so incredibly high and dense that anyone looking at them would instantly feel a sharp chill of worry, knowing all too well that dangerous snakes and venomous scorpions could easily hide within the shadows, entirely unseen. Even the front door itself was a heartbreaking sight. It was a crude, fragile barrier constructed from rotting, termite-eaten wood and scraps of thin zinc nailed together haphazardly. The wood had completely softened and decayed with time, and the rusted zinc pieces nailed to its surface had become so incredibly brittle that they looked as though they would literally crumble into sharp, metallic dust if a human hand touched them too roughly. Gazebo stood before this miserable sight, his breathing shallow, feeling the weight of his entire future resting on the next few seconds. He reached slowly into his faded pocket, his fingers trembling uncontrollably as they wrapped around a small, simple metal key. With a heavy, ragged breath, he stepped forward, inserted the key into the old, stiff lock, and turned it with a loud, echoing click. The fragile door creaked open with a long, agonizingly slow wail, revealing the dark, cramped interior within. Gazebo stepped aside, his face pale, and forced a small, profoundly vulnerable smile onto his lips. He looked deeply into the eyes of the woman he loved more than life itself, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "Tama," he said, his heart completely exposed, "welcome to my house." Tama did not move a single inch immediately. She froze entirely at the threshold, her body completely still as she stood at the entrance and allowed her gaze to slowly, deliberately sweep inside the room. The sight that greeted her was devastatingly bleak. The interior walls of the house were deeply cracked, the old paint entirely faded into a sickly, dirty gray color. In multiple prominent places, the cheap plaster had fallen off the structure completely, crumbling away to expose the rough, dark concrete blocks beneath, like deep, unhealed wounds on a dying building. The small wooden windows were incredibly ancient, their frames severely weakened, warped by moisture, and covered in thick layers of rust and dust. They looked so fragile, so thoroughly decayed by time, that they seemed as though they would collapse entirely into splinters if someone pushed them with even a fraction of force. The room itself was painfully, suffocatingly small, a claustrophobic box that offered absolutely no comfort. There was no proper bed frame. Instead, a thin, worn-out mattress lay directly on the hard, cold concrete floor, covered by a simple, faded bedsheet. A single cheap blue plastic chair stood lonely against the cracked wall, looking incredibly fragile. In the far corner, a small scratched wooden table sat quietly, its surface covered in a layer of fine dust. There was absolutely no fan to cool the oppressive heat, no television to break the heavy silence, no cupboard to store clothing, absolutely nothing that made the bleak space feel like a dignified, comfortable human home. The entire room felt profoundly empty, cold, and utterly desolate, a place where poverty had completely erased every single trace of joy. For a long, agonizing moment, Tama said absolutely nothing, her silence hanging in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog. Dezebo watched her face with an intensity that was almost painful, his eyes desperately scanning every micro-expression, every tiny movement of her features. He saw the initial shock and utter disbelief flash brightly in her wide eyes, followed quickly by a wave of profound confusion, and then a deep, unreadable emotion settled into her gaze, something complex, intense, completely beyond his immediate understanding. Dezebo, she finally spoke, her voice remarkably quiet, breaking the silence like glass. Is this? Is this really where you live? He swallowed hard, a painful lump forming in his throat as he forced himself to look her in the eye. Yes, he replied, his voice trembling with the terrifying expectation of her imminent departure. Yes, Tama, this is my home. Tama looked at him properly now, her gaze intense, deep, and focused, as if she was completely re-evaluating his entire existence from a totally different angle. All this time she had known him in the office. She had deeply admired him as a quiet, exceptionally humble, and noble man who worked tirelessly without ever boasting. She knew he dressed simply, she knew he lived a deeply modest life, but this extreme level of destitution was something else entirely. It was a level of poverty that crossed into pure, heartbreaking survival. This is why you never wanted to talk about your house, she said softly, her voice filled with a sudden profound realization. Dezebo gave a small, slow nod, his head hanging slightly. He had already carefully prepared this exact deceptive answer in his mind long before this day arrived, rehearsing the lie until it felt like second nature. I was completely stranded when I first came to Asaba, he said quietly, his voice laced with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. I could not afford anything better, and a distant friend helped me secure this place for a very low price just to keep a roof over my head. I have just been managing, cutting costs, and trying my best to save every single penny from my salary. Tama's eyes slowly moved around the miserable room once again, but this time her expression did not harden with disgust. Instead, her eyes began to soften with an incredibly deep, overwhelming empathy. She looked at the thin mattress on the floor and visualized him returning here every single evening after a long, exhausting day of being ordered around at work. She imagined him sleeping on that hard floor in the suffocating heat, sitting entirely alone in this quiet, depressing room, living this grueling, painful life month after month without ever complaining to a single soul or asking for pity. A heavy, profoundly painful feeling of deep sorrow settled tightly into her chest, making it difficult for her to breathe. She looked back at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You should have told me, Dezebo, she said, her voice rich with an intense emotion that completely stunned him. Dezebo looked down at the floor, utterly incapable of meeting her gaze. Tama stepped inside the room at last, her footsteps soft on the concrete. She walked over and touched the plastic chair lightly, then turned back to face him fully, her expression a mix of sorrow and gentle reproach. Why would you hide something like this from me? Did you truly think I would laugh at you? Did you honestly believe I would look down on you, or think less of you because of your struggles? Dezebo quickly shook his head, his heart racing as the sheer weight of his secret felt too heavy to hold. No, Tama, that is not what I thought. Then, what were you thinking? She asked, stepping closer to him, her voice demanding the honesty she believed she deserved. Dezebo sighed deeply, the torment in his soul reaching a breaking point as he looked into her beautiful, fiercely loyal eyes. For a brief, terrifying second, the massive secret he was carrying felt too immense, too suffocating to contain. I was scared, he confessed, his voice breaking with raw, genuine emotion. Tama's expression softened even further, the anger completely draining from her face. Scared of what, Dezebo? He looked straight into her soul, speaking the absolute truth of his deepest vulnerability. Scared of losing you, he said softly. Tama's eyes rippled with a profound tenderness. You still should have trusted me, she said gently. When someone truly cares about you, hiding a struggle like this hurts, because it means you are carrying the weight all by yourself. Dezebo nodded slowly, his chest tight with a mixture of overwhelming relief and intense guilt. I know. I am so deeply sorry. A profound, emotionally charged silence descended upon the small room, thick with raw vulnerability. Dezebo stood completely still, watching Tama with an intensity that bordered on desperation. This was exactly the terrifying peak of the crucible, the precise, dangerous moment when everything usually shattered in his past attempts. This was the exact second when people's expressions would permanently harden, when a cold, unmistakable disappointment would mask their features, and they would begin to subtly, rapidly pull away from him. Eager to escape the suffocating aura of his apparent poverty, But as the seconds ticked by, Dezebo realized with a shock that shot through his entire being that something was fundamentally beautifully different this time. The tone of Tama's voice, the profound warmth radiating from her eyes, and the gentle posture of her body did not sound or look like someone who was judging his worth or calculating an exit strategy. It sounded entirely like someone whose heart was filled with an unconditional protective affection for the man standing before her. Dezebo felt a wave of absolute astonishment wash over him, his mind reeling in pure disbelief. He could hardly credit his own ears, standing there frozen, looking at her wide-eyed, wondering if he had somehow misheard her words, or if he was trapped in a beautiful, cruel dream. The sheer joy and relief that flooded his soul was so intense it made him dizzy. Needing a moment to compose his shattered nerves and process this miraculous reality, he finally found his voice. Please, please sit down, he said, gesturing weakly to the single plastic chair. Let me quickly run to the nearby shop and buy us something cold to drink. Tama looked at the humble chair, then looked back at him with a warm, reassuring smile that made his soul sing. All right, Dezebo, she said softly, walking over to sit down. Dezebo nodded quickly, a genuine breathless smile breaking across his face as he stepped outside into the cooling evening air. As he walked with rapid, urgent strides down the dusty street toward the small neighborhood kiosk, a chaotic torrent of overwhelming thoughts and profound emotions filled his mind. He felt an intense, soaring happiness. The test had worked, and Tama had proven herself to be a diamond in a world full of cheap glass. He quickly bought 2 bottles of cold soda, his hands practically shaking with excitement, and hurried back to the house, desperate to return to her side. But the very moment he stepped across the threshold and into the small room, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The plastic chair was completely empty. The room was deathly silent. Tama was nowhere to be seen. Dezebo stood entirely paralyzed, holding the 2 cold drinks tightly in his hands, the blood freezing in his veins. For a terrifying moment he could not even breathe, a suffocating wave of familiar, crushing despair crashing down upon his head. His eyes searched the tiny house frantically, but the space was far too small for anyone to possibly hide. A brutal, agonizing realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. She left, he whispered to himself, his voice cracking as his vision blurred. A deeply painful, cynical smile appeared on his face as his heart broke into a million pieces. So, this is how it happens again. She was just playing along until I left the room. But just as he was about to drop the drinks and surrender to the darkness of his renewed cynicism, a sudden, clear voice shattered the heavy silence, coming from directly outside the small wooden window. Dezebo, Tama called out, her tone filled with practical curiosity. How do you even manage to live in a place like this? Is there even a proper bathroom anywhere in this compound? Dezebo spun around instantly, his heart leaping violently into his throat as he realized with an absolute jolt of pure, electrifying shock that she had not abandoned him at all. She was still there, completely invested in his world, and the true journey of their lives was only just beginning, bringing them closer to a chaotic collision with a ruthless antagonist who would soon threaten to destroy everything. The sudden wave of intense relief that crashed over Dezebo was almost dizzying, completely washing away the bitter taste of his brief, painful misunderstanding. He stood frozen for another heartbeat, his lungs finally expanding with air as the realization settled deep into his soul. Tama had not run away. She was still here, willingly stepping into the bleakest corners of what she believed was his harsh reality. Clutching the 2 cold drinks tightly, Dezebo stepped out of the suffocatingly small room and walked toward the backyard, where the evening shadows were growing longer and more ominous. He found Tama standing near a crumbling, broken concrete wall that marked the boundary of the neglected property. She was scanning the overgrown compound with a highly discerning, serious expression, completely unbothered by the wild, towering weeds that brushed against her clothes. When she noticed him approaching, her brow furrowed not with disgust, but with a deep, practical concern for his well-being. "Where is your bathroom, Dezebo?" she asked, her voice steady and grounded. Dezebo blinked, desperately trying to steady his rapid breathing and hide the emotional turmoil that had just gripped his chest. There is a small, communal one, right behind the building," he said, pointing a trembling hand toward a weathered wooden structure in the distance. Tama followed the direction of his hand, taking in the sight of the dilapidated facility, and nodded slowly, her mind clearly processing the immense daily difficulties he must endure. "Oh, I see it," she murmured softly. Then, turning her full attention back to him, she immediately noticed the intensely strange, emotionally exhausted expression plastered across his face. Why do you look like that, Dazebo? You look like you've just seen a ghost. Dazebo hesitated, caught between a desire to laugh at his own deeply rooted insecurities and a profound sense of vulnerability. I, I honestly thought you had left, he admitted, his voice dropping to a quiet, raw whisper. Tama's eyes widened in complete surprise, her features softening into an expression of pure disbelief. Left? She repeated, as if the very concept was entirely alien to her. Yes, Dazebo continued, looking down at the ground. When I stepped back inside and saw the empty chair, my mind automatically assumed the worst. I thought you took one look at this poverty and decided to walk out of my life, just like everyone else before you. Tama stared at him for a long, heavy second, her sharp gaze scanning the deep lines of anxiety on his face, reading the profound trauma of past disappointments that he had carried in silence for so long. She shook her head slowly, stepping closer until the distance between them entirely vanished. Dazebo, she said, her voice dropping to an incredibly gentle, nurturing register. Do you truly think I am that kind of shallow, heartless person? Do you honestly believe my feelings for you are attached to a bank account or a piece of real estate? Dazebo let out a long, ragged sigh, unable to meet her eyes. I don't know what to believe anymore, Tama, he said with heartbreaking honesty. I have seen the ugliest sides of human nature in my life. I have seen people smile at you only for what they can gain, and vanish the moment the comfort disappears. Tama's heart broke for the man standing before her. For the very first time on this emotional evening, she saw past his usual calm, humble workspace persona and witnessed a deep, agonizing pain lurking in his eyes, the kind of profound, agonizing torment that only comes from being betrayed and rejected by people who claim to love you, happening far too many times. Her maternal and romantic instincts instantly flared to life. Without a single moment of hesitation, she stepped into his personal space and placed her warm, delicate hand firmly on his arm. Listen to me very carefully, Dazebo, she commanded gently, forcing him to look up. What I feel for you has absolutely nothing to do with this dilapidated house, this broken wall, or the amount of money you have in your pockets. I care about your brilliant mind, your incredibly kind soul, and the deep respect you show to everyone around you. I care about you, Dazebo, not about what you own or what you can give me materially. She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his with absolute unwavering sincerity. I love you, Dazebo. The powerful, sacred words landed heavily in the quiet evening air between them, echoing through the desolate compound like a beautiful, redemptive melody. For a long moment, Dazebo could not move a single muscle, his entire body entirely paralyzed by the sheer weight of her unconditional devotion. He had heard those exact 3 words spoken to him before in his past life of immense luxury, but those past declarations had always felt heavy with hidden motives, calculated and deeply superficial. But this moment, surrounded by rusted zinc, cracked walls, and towering weeds, felt completely pure, terrifyingly real, and profoundly holy. He opened his mouth to respond, to pour out his soul, but the overwhelming tide of emotion choked the words right in his throat. I, he stammered, his eyes filling with tears of profound gratitude. Tama smiled with a beautiful, radiant warmth, understanding his silence completely. You don't have to say anything right now, she whispered gently. She reached out and pulled his rigid, trembling body into a deep, incredibly warm embrace. Dazebo stood frozen for a fraction of a second before his arms slowly, desperately wrapped around her waist, burying his face into her shoulder. His chest felt incredibly tight, completely suffocating, but this time it was not from the cold, paralyzing grip of fear. It was from the pure, unadulterated explosion of genuine human emotion. He had finally found her. He had finally found the one soul who would stand by him in the dirt. After a few blissful seconds, Tama pulled back slightly, her hands remaining on his shoulders as she looked up at him with a determined, beautifully supportive expression. From this day forward, she declared with a bright smile, after our long shifts at the office, we will come here together. I will stay here with you, help you clean up this space, and keep you company for a few hours every evening before I head back to my place. You will never have to endure this solitude alone again. Dazebo looked at her, his mind entirely blown by her sheer selflessness. Here, you willingly want to spend your evenings in a place like this? He asked, completely stunned. Yes, she said, her smile widening. This is your home, right? And since it is your home, it is perfectly fine for me. Now come on, let's go inside. I believe you brought us something cold to drink. They walked back inside the tiny, dim room, the heavy, oppressive feeling that had dominated the space just an hour prior, completely evaporating into nothingness. Tama sat down gracefully on the cheap plastic chair, entirely unbothered by its instability, while Dazebo sat on the edge of the simple mattress on the floor. They popped open the cold drinks, the sharp, refreshing sound breaking the silence, and began to talk. They talked about the chaotic events of the office, laughed genuinely at the absurd, arrogant behaviors of their corporate managers, and shared deeply personal stories from their respective childhoods. Time passed quietly, slipping away entirely unnoticed as the dark night completely blanketed the city of Asaba. Later that evening, under the dim glow of the streetlights, Dazebo walked Tama down the rough road to the nearby bus stop. When the crowded public bus pulled up, Tama turned to him, her eyes shining with absolute warmth. "Thank you for finally trusting me enough to bring me into your private world, Dazebo," she said sincerely. Dazebo stared at her, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it threatened to burst. "Thank you for staying, Tama," he replied, his voice thick with unspoken gratitude. Tama smiled beautifully, whispering a tender goodnight before stepping into the bus. Dazebo stood completely motionless on the pavement, his eyes fixed on the vehicle as it slowly merged into the chaotic night traffic and disappeared down the long, winding road. When it was completely out of sight, he turned and walked back to the old, decaying shack. That night, as he lay flat on his back on the small mattress, staring up at the intricate patterns of rust on the zinc roof, Tama's powerful words echoed relentlessly through his mind. "I love you." He placed his arm behind his head, letting out a soft, emotionally exhausted sigh. "I love her too," he whispered into the dark, quiet room. "I love her with everything I have." But as the initial bliss of her confession began to settle, a new, terrifyingly dark thought crept into his mind, casting a cold shadow over his joy. What would happen when she finally discovered the gargantuan lie he was living? What would happen when she realized he was not a poor office clerk, but the extraordinarily wealthy son of the billionaire chairman, Mr. Jabba? He was living a massive deception, and deep down, Dazebo knew that while her love was entirely real, the revelation of his true identity could feel like the ultimate devastating betrayal. The golden hue of romance, however, was about to be violently tarnished by the grim, unforgiving reality of their daily workplace. As the weeks flew by, Dazebo and Tama grew inseparable, their souls bonding tightly in the quiet evenings spent at the old house. At the office, they tried their absolute best to remain entirely professional, acting as though nothing had changed between them. They spoke normally with other staff members, focused intently on their mountain of corporate files, and maintained a polite distance. But human beings are not blind, and the corporate office was a hotbed of intense gossip and toxic surveillance. Everyone in the building could see that a deeply special, unbreakable bond was forming between the quiet, impoverished clerk and the beautiful, dignified department assistant. They walked into the building together in the early mornings, their steps perfectly synchronized. They departed together in the evenings, and during lunch breaks they could always be found sitting outside in a quiet corner, sharing food and engrossed in deep, whispered conversations. These small, beautiful moments of pure connection were more than enough to set the office rumor mill into a frantic spin. While some junior workers watched them with harmless curiosity, one specific individual in the upper echelons of management was watching them with an entirely different emotion, a toxic, burning hatred that grew more volatile with each passing day. That man was Mr. Omari. Mr. Omari was one of the most senior administrative staff members in the branch, a man who wielded immense power over the daily lives of the junior employees. He had been with the company for many years, managing critical operational duties with a cold, dictatorial efficiency. Because of his long tenure and close ties to upper management, the junior staff feared him intensely, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid landing on his notoriously vindictive bad side. He was known throughout the building for being extremely strict, deeply arrogant, and intentionally difficult to work with. But his deep-seated animosity toward Dazebo was born from a place of highly personal, narcissistic rejection. Months earlier, before Dazebo had even joined the department, Mr. Omari had set his predatory sights on Tama. He had used his high corporate position to shower her with unwanted attention, making arrogant advances and attempting to force her into a romantic relationship. But Tama, a woman of immense integrity and self-respect, had politely but firmly turned him down, refusing to be bought by his wealth or intimidated by his corporate title. Since that humiliating day, Mr. Omari's massive ego had been deeply bruised, and his heart had twisted into a dark knot of resentment. Seeing Tama completely reject his affluent advances, only to willingly throw herself into the arms of a man he firmly believed was nothing more than a pathetic, dirt-poor, low-wage office clerk, drove Mr. Omari into a state of absolute obsessive fury. It was a direct insult to his vanity. He could not comprehend how a woman could choose a penniless nonentity over a powerful man of status like himself. And that was precisely why his daily attitude toward Dazebo slowly shifted from arrogant neglect into a campaign of deliberate, systematic cruelty and intense workplace victimization, one exceptionally hot afternoon. When the pressure in the office was at its peak and the air was thick with the sound of frantic typing and ringing phones, Mr. Omari decided to unleash his toxic malice fully. Sitting back in his plush leather chair, he looked out across the open-plan office and spotted Dazebo quietly working at his cramped desk, meticulously organizing a massive stack of financial documents. A sinister, arrogant smile crept onto Mr. Omari's face. "Dazebo," he shouted out loudly, his harsh, booming voice echoing across the entire room, instantly causing several workers to flinch and look up from their computers. Dazebo paused, calmly closing the file he was holding. He stood up, adjusted his simple faded shirt, and walked over to the manager's imposing desk. "Yes, sir," Dazebo said, his voice entirely respectful and calm. Mr. Omari didn't even bother to look him in the eye. Instead, he tapped his manicured finger heavily on a gargantuan, disorganized mountain of dusty archive files sitting on the floor. "Take these useless documents down to the old storage room in the damp basement immediately," he ordered sharply, "and make sure you catalog every single page before the end of the day." Dazebo nodded without a hint of anger, his internal discipline keeping his emotions perfectly in check. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly. He knelt down, gathered the heavy dust-covered files into his arms, and carried them out of the room, doing exactly as he was told, without a single murmur of discontent. But Mr. Omari was far from finished. He wanted an absolute, public humiliation. A few minutes later, the very second Dazebo walked back into the office. His hands covered in gray basement dust, Mr. Omari called out to him again, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dazebo!" "Get back over here," Dazebo returned to the desk, standing calmly before the tyrant. "Yes, sir." Mr. Omari leaned back, crossing his arms arrogantly. "Go down to the kitchen and bring me a chilled bottle of water. And hurry up, I don't have all day for your slow, impoverished pace." Dazebo quietly turned around, walked to the small office kitchen, retrieved a cold bottle of water, and placed it neatly on the manager's desk. Mr. Omari grabbed the bottle, took a slow sip, and then slammed it down intentionally, splashing a few drops across the polished wood. He then grabbed a dirty, grease-stained cloth from his drawer and threw it directly at Dazebo's chest. "Now, get on your knees and clean this entire desk until it shines. Look at the dust you brought up from the basement. Clean it now." Dazebo froze slightly, the cloth clutching in his hand. He had already successfully completed every single one of his actual corporate tasks for the day, and cleaning desks was absolutely not part of his job description. He knew with absolute certainty that Mr. Omari was intentionally crossing the line into pure bullying, trying to break his spirit in front of the entire office. Dazebo took a deep, centering breath, reminding himself of his purpose, and began to quietly wipe down the desk, choosing to maintain his peace. Mr. Omari watched him intently, a smug, highly sadistic smile stretching across his face as he leaned forward, lowering his voice so the surrounding workers could hear his venomous words. "You actually think you are someone important in this office, don't you, Dazebo?" he asked suddenly, his voice dripping with pure malice. Dazebo did not stop wiping the desk, keeping his eyes down. "No, sir. I am just an employee doing my job," he replied calmly. Mr. Omari let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed harshly through the quiet room. "Good, excellent," he sneered, "because you are absolutely nothing here. You are a complete zero, a pathetic, penniless nobody who should be groveling on his knees every single day. Utterly grateful that this prestigious company even allows a gutter-born peasant like you to have a job here." Dazebo's hand slowly stopped moving. The sheer unprovoked cruelty of the words pierced through his calm facade, and for the very first time the sleeping lion within the billionaire's son began to stir. The immense injustice of the situation burned in his veins. He stood up to his full height, dropping the cloth onto the desk, and looked Mr. Omari directly in the eyes, with a fierce, quiet intensity that instantly made the manager falter for a microsecond. Sir, Dezebo said, his voice terrifyingly calm, steady and resolute. I have shown you nothing but absolute professional respect since I arrived here, but I must ask you to treat me with basic human respect as well. My financial status does not give you the right to degrade me. The entire office instantly fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The sound of typing stopped completely. Every single eye in the room widened in absolute shock. Nobody had ever dared to stand up to the tyrannical Mr. Omari. The manager's face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, his skin turning a deep, angry crimson as his massive ego was violently bruised in front of his subordinates. What did you just say to me? Mr. Omari roared, his voice trembling with fury. I only said that we should respect each other as human beings, sir, Dezebo repeated, his posture completely unyielding. Mr. Omari stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair slammed against the wall behind him. How dare you? How dare a pathetic, penniless piece of trash like you talk back to me? He screamed. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Mr. Omari lunged across the desk, his hand reaching out to viciously grab the collar of Dezebo's shirt, ripping a button in the process. You will apologize to me right now on your knees, or I will ensure you are thrown into the streets to starve, he demanded, his spit flying through the air. Dezebo looked at the hand gripping his shirt, then looked directly into the manager's crazed eyes, his voice remaining solid as a rock. I have done absolutely nothing wrong, sir. I will not apologize. Mr. Omari's rage completely consumed his sanity. Say sorry, he shouted at the top of his lungs. Dezebo shook his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. I cannot apologize for simply asking to be treated like a human being. Without a single second of warning, driven by pure, unchecked malice, Mr. Omari raised his right hand and delivered a violent, resounding slap straight across Dezebo's face. The sharp, brutal sound of the impact echoed through the large office space like a gunshot. Everyone froze in absolute horror, several female workers gasping loudly as they covered their mouths. Dezebo's head snapped to the side, his cheek instantly turning a fiery, angry red. He felt the sharp, stinging pain, but his immense internal discipline held him back. He did not raise his fists, he did not strike back, standing completely still as he held his throbbing cheek. But just as Mr. Omari raised his hand to strike him a second time, a sharp, fiercely authoritative voice cut through the air like a razor blade. Stop it right now. Is this how you treat human beings in this office? Everyone spun around instantly to see Tama standing at the entrance of the department, her face completely pale with shock and absolute outrage. She had stepped out of her office after hearing the chaotic shouting, only to witness the brutal, unjust assault on the man she loved. Her eyes blazed with a fierce protective fire as she marched forward, her gaze moving from Mr. Omari's guilty face to the brilliant red mark on Dezebo's cheek. What on earth do you think you are doing, Mr. Omari? She demanded, her voice shaking with an intense, righteous anger. Mr. Omari frowned deeply, trying desperately to regain his composure and maintain his authoritative mask, though his hand was slightly trembling. Stay out of this, Tama, he sneered defensively, pointing a finger at her. This is strictly a disciplinary matter between management and a completely insubordinate, useless clerk. This is absolutely none of your business. Tama stepped forward confidently, placing her body directly between the abusive manager and Dezebo, shielding him completely with her own presence. It becomes my absolute business, and the business of everyone in this company, when a human being is being treated with such disgusting, illegal unfairness and brutal physical abuse, she fired back, her voice echoing with absolute courage. Mr. Omari hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, suddenly realizing that the entire staff was watching him with expressions of profound disgust and silent rebellion. Tama's voice remained absolutely firm, cold, and unyielding as she stared down the tyrant. If you lay so much as a single finger on him ever again, or if you continue to threaten his livelihood, I will personally bypass this entire branch and report your abusive actions directly to the high management and the Human Resources Board, with every single witness in this room to back me up. For a long, terrifying moment, the room stayed completely silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Omari's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew she had him cornered. With a frustrated, bitter snarl, he slowly released his tight grip on Dezebo's torn shirt. He looked around the room, realized his absolute authority had been completely shattered, and sat back down in his chair with a heavy, nervous hesitation. Dezebo stood there quietly, straightening his ruined collar, his heart feeling incredibly heavy, not from the physical pain of the slap, but from the overwhelming agonizing realization that Tama had just risked her entire career to defend an impoverished clerk, completely unaware that he possessed the power to destroy this entire company with a single phone call. The sheer weight of his massive deception was now becoming an unbearable torture, setting the stage for a spectacular, dramatic revelation that would change their lives forever. The bitter sting of the slap faded from Dezebo's cheek, but the psychological weight of the incident lingered in the office air like a toxic cloud. Later that evening, the small, dilapidated house in the Asaba slum felt even more quiet and desolate than usual. Dezebo sat on the edge of the simple mattress, his elbows resting on his knees, staring intently at the cracked concrete floor. His mind was in a state of absolute chaos. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the resounding echo of Mr. Omari's hand striking his face, followed instantly by the image of Tama stepping forward like a fierce warrior to shield him from further harm. She had risked her standing, her professional reputation, and her daily peace in that corporate office to protect a man she genuinely believed had no power, no money, and no voice to defend himself. The immense injustice of the situation burned deep within Dezebo's soul, but what tortured him even more was the growing, suffocating size of his own deception. The test of loyalty was completely over. Tama had proven her heart to be pure gold, yet he was still trapping her in a fabricated reality of poverty and struggle. He looked around the small, dark room, feeling a profound wave of guilt. He was a billionaire's son playing a dangerous game with a woman's pure emotions. And he knew that every single day he delayed telling her the truth, the impending explosion would only become more destructive. A soft, hesitant knock on the old wooden door shattered his deep, heavy thoughts. Dezebo stood up quickly, his heart skipping a beat. "Tama?" he called out anxiously. "Yes, Dezebo, it's me." Her gentle voice came through the fragile wooden barrier. He quickly unlocked the door and pulled it open. Tama stepped into the dim room, her eyes scanning his face with intense maternal concern. She had left the office slightly later than him to tie up loose corporate files, and she had assumed his abrupt departure was due to the immense humiliation he had suffered at the hands of Mr. Omari. She closed the door slowly behind her, shutting out the noises of the slum. "I've been thinking about what happened today at work, Dezebo," she said, her voice filled with a deep, unyielding seriousness. Dezebo forced a faint, tired smile and shook his head, trying to minimize the event. "It's nothing, Tama. Truly, I am fine. It is just the reality of life when you are at the bottom of the ladder." Tama's eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp anger at his compliance. "No, Dezebo, you are not fine and you should never normalize that kind of cruelty." She walked further into the cramped space, sitting down on the fragile blue plastic chair. "You should not allow arrogant people like Mr. Omari to treat you as if you are completely worthless. You are a brilliant, hardworking man, and you deserve absolute respect, regardless of your position or your bank account." Her words sliced directly into Dezebo's heart, causing a profound wave of emotional agony. He realized with absolute clarity that if she knew who he truly was, the heir to the entire corporate empire, the situation would be completely inverted. Mr. Omari would be groveling at his feet, and Tama would not be crying tears of sorrow for his victimization. Dezebo walked over and stood near the small wooden table, his back to her for a moment as he gathered his courage. He hesitated, his fingers tracing the dusty surface before turning to ask a question that had been burning in his soul for days. "Tama, let me ask you something important. What would you do if someone you loved deeply, someone you trusted completely, was hiding a massive, monumental secret from you?" Tama frowned slightly, her sharp mind sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Hiding something from me?" she repeated quietly. "Yes," Dezebo continued, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "Something so huge that it changes the entire dynamic of how you view their life." Tama leaned back in the plastic chair, thinking deeply for a long, quiet moment while Dezebo held his breath. "If the secret was hidden out of malice or to maliciously deceive me, I would feel deeply betrayed," she said slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "But if the person hid it because they were deeply afraid, because they were broken by past experiences and trying to protect their heart, I would definitely feel disappointed at first. But I would still want to understand their pain. I would want to know why they couldn't trust me with the truth." Dezebo looked at her, his soul weeping at her immense kindness and emotional maturity. Her pure, beautiful understanding made the golden secret he was carrying feel even heavier, like a mountain of lead crushing his chest. He wanted to scream the truth right there, to tell her that he owned the very ground they stood on, but the words froze in his throat, blocked by a lingering, desperate fear of losing the paradise he had finally found. The next morning, across the city, the corporate office had turned into a highly toxic environment. Mr. Omari, far from being humbled by Tama's fierce intervention, had spent the entire night stewing in a state of absolute narcissistic fury. His public humiliation had completely alienated him from his usual sense of dominance, and he blamed Dezebo entirely for the loss of his authority. When Dezebo walked into the department that morning, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Mr. Omari sat at his elevated desk like a predatory animal, his eyes burning with a dark, vengeful malice as he watched Dezebo sit down at his cramped workspace. The villain had decided to shift his strategy from overt physical abuse to an intense, calculated campaign of workplace sabotage. He began intentionally altering Dezebo's daily corporate assignments, secretly deleting critical files from the shared digital system, and assigning him impossible, conflicting deadlines, hoping desperately to create a massive professional failure that would justify his immediate, unceremonious termination. He wanted to see Dezebo utterly ruined, thrown into the streets of Asaba with absolutely nothing, so he could show Tama the ultimate futility of loving a penniless clerk. Every single time Dezebo submitted a perfectly organized report, Mr. Omari would publicly tear it to shreds, throwing the papers into the trash can with a loud, arrogant laugh. "This is absolute garbage, just like the person who wrote it," he would shout loudly, ensuring the entire department heard his cruel taunts. Dezebo endured the intense psychological torture with a terrifying stoic calm, his internal identity as a powerful businessman, allowing him to see right through the petty, desperate maneuvers of his superior. He remained completely silent, doing his work over and over again, while the surrounding coworkers watched, with a mixture of profound pity and growing resentment toward the management. Tama watched this escalating cruelty with a breaking heart and a rising tide of fury. She spent her days constantly running to Dezebo's desk, helping him recompile the deleted files, defending him during toxic team meetings, and whispering words of profound emotional support into his ear when the pressure felt unbearable. "Don't let him break you, Dezebo," she would whisper fiercely during their short lunch breaks. "He is an insecure bully who is furious because he cannot buy my affection, and because he cannot break your noble spirit. We will get through this together, I promise you." Dezebo would look into her beautiful, tired eyes, his heart breaking at the sheer exhaustion she was enduring just to protect his fake identity. The sheer irony of the situation was reaching a magnificent, agonizing peak. The billionaire heir was allowing himself to be publicly degraded and sabotaged by a low-level manager, while the woman he loved was burning her own professional energy to save him, completely unaware that a single word from Dezebo's mouth could wipe Mr. Omari off the corporate map forever. That very night, after another exhausting, emotionally draining 12-hour shift of relentless bullying, Dezebo stood outside the building and watched Tama board her usual crowded public bus. The moment the vehicle disappeared down the dark, neon-lit highway, Dezebo's calm facade completely vanished, replaced by a cold, fierce, and unyielding determination. He pulled his simple smartphone from his pocket, his fingers tapping the screen with an absolute authority that he hadn't used in months. He dialed a highly private, direct number. After only 2 sharp rings, the deep, calm, and immensely powerful voice of his billionaire father, Mr. Jabba, echoed through the speaker. "My son," the tycoon said, sensing the immense gravity in Dezebo's silence, "how is everything going in Asaba? Is the experiment reaching its conclusion?" Dezebo took a deep, shuddering breath, his eyes hardening into flint as he looked back at the corporate building. "Father, it is time," Dezebo declared, his voice dropping into the cold, commanding register of a seasoned CEO. "The test is completely over. I have found the woman of my dreams, a soul whose love is entirely pure, unconditional, and fierce. But she is suffering deeply because of my lie, and a corrupt, tyrannical manager in your Asaba branch is physically and professionally abusing your employees. I need you to come down here immediately. The truth must be revealed, and justice must be executed with absolute finality." The morning sun rose over the city of Asaba, casting long, sharp shadows across the corporate headquarters, entirely unaware of the monumental storm that was about to break within its walls. Dezebo woke up earlier than usual, sitting on the edge of his simple mattress, his heart hammering a fierce, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. Today was the day. The long, grueling months of deception, the exhausting test of loyalty, and the relentless workplace torment were all about to collide in a single, explosive moment of absolute reckoning. When Dazebo entered the office, his posture was remarkably different. Gone was the slight, submissive slouch of an impoverished clerk, replaced by a quiet, rigid authority that went entirely unnoticed by the bustling staff. Tama was already at her desk, her face pale and lined with exhaustion from weeks of fighting a lone battle to protect him. She looked up and forced a warm, deeply worried smile. She said softly, her eyes scanning his face for any new signs of distress. "Good morning, Tama," Dazebo replied, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly serious register. "Please, no matter what happens today, remember what you told me about understanding the fear behind a secret. There is something monumental I need to tell you, and we will talk at lunch." Tama looked deeply curious, a faint trace of apprehension clouding her warm eyes, but before she could question him, the sharp, arrogant voice of Mr. Omari shattered the morning peace like breaking glass. "Dazebo, get your useless self over here right now," the manager shouted loudly from his elevated desk, his face twisted in his usual expression of profound, toxic malice. Dazebo walked over calmly, standing before the tyrant without a single trace of fear. Mr. Omari slammed a heavy, disorganized stack of corporate onboarding files onto the desk, splashing his morning coffee onto the paperwork intentionally. "Take these messy documents down to the basement storage room and index them immediately," he ordered sharply, leaning back in his chair with a smug, cruel grin. Dazebo looked at the files, then looked Mr. Omari directly in the eyes. "I am currently on my official morning break, sir," Dazebo replied with a terrifyingly calm, even tone. "I will handle the basement files the exact moment my break concludes." The entire open plan office instantly went dead silent. Workers froze at their computers, their jaws dropping at Dazebo's sudden unprecedented refusal to bow to the tyrant. Mr. Omari's face instantly changed from smug satisfaction to an absolute deep crimson mask of pure, unadulterated narcissistic rage. His massive ego was violently bruised in front of the entire department. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that, you pathetic, penniless piece of trash?" Mr. Omari roared, his voice trembling with fury. He stood up so violently, his chair slammed into the wall, and he lunged across the desk, aggressively grabbing the front of Dazebo's simple shirt in a tight, suffocating grip. Several workers stood up in shock, and Tama rushed forward without a single second of hesitation. "What on earth are you doing? Release him right now, Mr. Omari," she screamed fiercely, throwing her hands forward to aggressively push the abusive manager back. Mr. Omari snarled, his eyes crazed with anger as he used his free hand to violently push Tama away, causing her to stumble back against a desk. "Stay out of this, Tama. I am going to teach this insubordinate beggar a lesson he will never forget," he shouted at the top of his lungs, his hand raised to deliver another brutal slap across Dazebo's face, but the violent hand never fell. At that exact, hypertense second, the heavy double-glass doors of the main entrance swung open with immense force, and a sudden, profound hush fell over the entire corporate premises. Two tall, muscular men dressed in immaculate black designer suits and wearing security earpieces stepped into the room first, clearing the path with absolute military precision. Behind them walked an elderly man of immense, unmistakable power, radiating a supreme aura of absolute corporate authority. He was dressed in a tailored three-piece suit that cost more than Mr. Omari's annual salary, and his sharp, discerning eyes swept across the room like a hawk. The moment the senior staff and department heads saw his face, their expressions transformed instantly into masks of pure, unmitigated terror and deep reverence. "It's the chairman. Mr. Jabba is here," someone whispered frantically in the background. The powerful billionaire walked slowly, his expensive shoes echoing loudly against the polished floor as he took in the chaotic scene. His gaze locked directly onto the back of the department, landing squarely on Mr. Omari, whose hand was still tightly gripping Dazebo's torn shirt, entirely unaware of the gargantuan presence behind him. Mr. Jabba walked forward with a calm, terrifying authority that made the air in the room turn ice cold. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, his booming voice cutting through the suffocating silence like a thunderclap. "Dazebo, my son, what exactly is going on here?" The word son echoed through the large office premises like a massive, devastating explosion, shattering the reality of every single person in the room. The entire department stood absolutely paralyzed, their minds completely unable to process the words they had just heard. Tama stood frozen beside Dazebo, her breath catching violently in her throat as her eyes widened into circles of absolute, paralyzing shock. Her gaze darted frantically from the powerful billionaire chairman to the quiet, impoverished clerk standing before her, her voice trembling in a faint, breathless whisper. Dezebo, your son? Do you know him? Dezebo looked deeply into Tama's eyes, his heart breaking at the profound confusion and hurt already pooling in her gaze. He had imagined revealing his true identity to her 1,000 times in quiet romance, but never like this. Never as a public spectacle of absolute shock. Mr. Jabba looked at Dezebo with deep paternal concern, completely ignoring the trembling manager. My son, the chairman repeated firmly. I came to inspect this branch personally and to check on your progress. You have lived in this struggle for far too long. Now, tell me, who is this man holding your shirt? And why is he treating an employee of this company like an animal? The premises fell into an even deeper, more terrifying silence. There was no longer a single shred of doubt. The simple, quiet, impoverished office clerk that everyone had been ordering around, the man who brought them water and cleaned their desks, was actually the sole heir to the multi-million-dollar global business empire, Mr. Omari suddenly felt his entire stomach drop into an abyss of pure, paralyzing terror. A cold, violent sweat broke out across his forehead, and his knees began to shake so violently he could barely stand. He remembered every single cruel insult he had hurled at Dezebo, every impossible deadline, the digital sabotage, and most devastatingly, the violent slap he had delivered across the billionaire heir's face. The realization that he had physically assaulted the son of the most powerful tycoon in the country hit him like a physical blow, completely draining the blood from his face until he looked like a moving corpse. He rapidly released his grip on Dezebo's shirt, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he took 3 panicked steps backward, nearly tripping over his own trash can. Dezebo calmly straightened his ruined collar, brushed the dust off his shoulders, and stood to his full, imposing height, completely shedding the persona of the humble clerk. He looked at his father, his voice steady, deep, and commanding. Father, Dezebo said clearly, the words cementing the absolute truth. Mr. Jabba turned his sharp, icy gaze toward the senior staff members, who were now bowing their heads in terror. What exactly is happening in this department? The chairman demanded, his voice radiating a dangerous, quiet anger. Omari stepped forward, his voice breaking completely as he began to stutter, his arrogant mask entirely shattered into 1,000 pieces of pathetic desperation. Sir, Chairman Jabba! Please, it was just a small misunderstanding, a minor workplace friction. I swear to you, he stammered, tears of sheer panic welling up in his eyes. Mr. Jabba's expression hardened into pure flint, his eyes flashing with a terrifying brilliance. What kind of misunderstanding allows a manager to grip an employee's shirt and raise his hand in violence? The billionaire fired back, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Mr. Omari's voice cracked completely, his hands flying up in a begging gesture, completely humiliated in front of the junior staff who were now watching his total downfall with immense satisfaction. I did not know he was your son, corporate chairman. If I had known, I would never. Mr. Jabba cut him off with a slice of his hand, his voice dropping to a cold, devastating whisper that penetrated the entire room. That is the absolute peak of your corruption, Mr. Omari. It should not matter if an employee is the chairman's son or the newest, lowest paid worker in this building. No human being in this company will ever be treated with disrespect, degradation, or physical violence under my watch. Your complete lack of basic human decency proves you are entirely unfit to hold any position of authority. The tyrant stood there in absolute paralyzed shock, his mouth hanging open as his entire career, his high status, and his inflated ego were permanently erased in a matter of seconds. Mr. Jabba looked at the trembling manager one final time, delivering the ultimate stroke of justice. Until the legal board and human resources complete a full criminal review of your physical assault today, you are relieved of your duties immediately. Security, escort this disgraced man out of my building permanently. The 2 massive guards stepped forward, grabbing Mr. Omari's arms and dragging him away as he wept and begged for mercy, his loud laments fading down the hallway in complete humiliation. The room achieved a complete triumph of justice, a spectacular unmasking that left everyone breathless. But for Tama, the surrounding world had completely faded into a blur of painful white noise. The complete shock and panic of the revelation had crystallized into something far deeper and infinitely more painful, a profound sense of absolute betrayal. She looked at Dezebo, the man she had loved unconditionally, the man she had defended with her life, the man she thought slept on a thin mattress in a leaky, ruined shack. He was not a struggling orphan. He was a prince masquerading in the mud. You, she whispered, her voice trembling violently, as tears of deep disappointment finally spilled over her cheeks. You are the chairman's son. Gazebo took a desperate step closer to her, his hands extended, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing plea. Tama, please let me explain. I was going to tell you today, I swear it. But Tama raised her hand gently, her gesture filled with a quiet, heartbreaking finality that stopped him dead in his tracks. Please, she said, her voice shaking with an intense emotional pain. Just stop. All this time, you let me believe your life was a brutal struggle. You made me weep for your poverty. You made me carry the burden of your safety. And the entire time you were just testing me like a lab rat in your golden cage. Gazebo's voice broke as he tried to bridge the widening chasm between them. I only wanted to know if someone could love me for me, without the money. Tama shook her head slowly, stepping back into the shadow of the exit. That was not your decision to make, Gazebo. You took away my absolute right to choose, and you turned my genuine love into a game. I trusted you completely, but I need space. She turned around, her shoulders shaking with deep, silent sobs, and walked out of the office, leaving the victorious billionaire heir standing entirely alone in the center of his father's empire. Realizing that in winning his test of loyalty, he had catastrophically lost the only heart that truly mattered. The echoes of that dramatic showdown slowly faded from the office walls, but the consequences of that fateful morning permanently reshaped the destinies of everyone involved, proving that the invisible wheels of karma always grind with absolute precision. For the arrogant and tyrannical Mr. Omari, the downfall was swift, brutal, and entirely unyielding. Stripped of his high corporate title, his hefty monthly salary, and his inflated sense of authority, he was thrown out of the building like common trash. The internal legal investigation initiated by Chairman Jabba did not stop at workplace bullying. It uncovered years of financial discrepancies, systematic embezzlement of company resources, and multiple counts of severe worker intimidation that Mr. Omari had carefully buried during his long tenure. Facing a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and a unified block of junior workers who finally found the courage to testify against him, the fallen manager was completely blacklisted from the entire corporate sector. With his professional reputation utterly annihilated and his bank accounts frozen to repay the stolen funds, he plummeted into the very depths of the poverty he had so viciously mocked. Today, he wanders the hot, dusty streets of distant towns, a broken, penniless man, trapped in a miserable reality where he must beg for the very crumbs of basic human respect he once denied to a quiet office clerk. His story became a legendary cautionary tale within the corporate world, a stark, undeniable proof that those who use their temporary power to crush the vulnerable will ultimately be crushed by the heavy weight of their own wicked actions. Meanwhile, the deep, agonizing silence that fell between Gazebo and Tama during those long weeks of separation served as a painful crucible for both of their souls. Gazebo returned to his family's grand, sprawling mansion in Buguma, surrounded once again by a fleet of luxury cars, gold-trimmed corridors, and a life of immense, effortless privilege. Yet, none of the opulent wealth brought even a fraction of comfort to his grieving heart. The vast, quiet rooms felt more like a golden prison than a home. He spent his evenings sitting on his plush balcony, staring out into the dark horizon, realizing with an absolute crushing clarity that his wealth was entirely meaningless without the pure, fiercely loyal woman who had willingly stood by him in the mud. He understood the profound depth of her hurt. By treating her love as a lab experiment, he had unintentionally insulted her integrity and stripped away her right to an honest partnership. Across the city, Tama was fighting her own silent, deeply emotional battle. At first, her soul was consumed by a burning sense of anger and betrayal. She replayed the moment of the revelation over and over, feeling as though the beautiful, simple connection they had built in that leaky, rusted shack had been completely synthetic. But true love, when it is rooted deeply in the core of a person's character, has a miraculous way of cutting through the thickest layers of pride and pain. As the days bled into weeks, her anger slowly dissolved into a profound, mature understanding. She remembered the raw terror in Gazebo's eyes when he thought she had abandoned him for a bathroom. She remembered the deep, unhealed scars of past betrayals that he had carried in absolute secrecy. She realized that his massive deception was not born from a desire to maliciously play with her feelings, but from a desperate, broken cry for a love that was completely untainted by the corrupting influence of gold. Recognizing the immense value of Tama's rare, incorruptible character, Chairman Jabba quietly arranged for her professional advancement, ensuring she was transferred away from the toxic environment of the Asaba branch to a highly prestigious, elevated position at the corporate headquarters. A month later, as Tama adjusted to her beautiful new executive office, a formal message arrived requesting her presence in the main CEO boardroom. When she slowly pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, her breath caught in her throat. Dezebo was standing by the massive glass window, dressed not in his faded clerk shirt, but in an immaculate, sharply tailored navy blue suit that perfectly matched his natural noble authority. The air between them was instantly thick, with weeks of unexpressed longing and deep, raw vulnerability. Dezebo stepped forward, his eyes pleading, his voice dropping to a soft, deeply emotional register as he laid his entire soul bare before her, offering no excuses, only a profound, heartfelt apology for his lack of initial trust. Tama looked into his eyes, seeing past the expensive designer suit to the exact same humble, fiercely protective man she had fallen for in the slums. With a gentle, tearful smile that lifted a mountain of guilt from Dezebo's shoulders, she extended her hand and whispered her complete forgiveness, uttering a final, powerful warning to never test the loyalty of her heart ever again. Their love, having successfully survived the ultimate devastating trial of deception, emerged infinitely stronger, completely unshakable, and beautifully anchored in absolute truth. 3 months later, the ultimate triumph of love and justice culminated in a breathtaking wedding celebration that people would talk about for generations. The grand, flower-decorated hall was completely filled with loving family members, close friends, and cheering colleagues who had witnessed their incredible journey. Dezebo stood proudly at the altar, his eyes shining with a radiant, genuine joy as he watched Tama walk down the aisle in a spectacular white gown, a picture of pure grace and unmatched dignity. As they exchanged their sacred vows, promising to protect, cherish, and stand by each other through every storm of life, Chairman Jabba watched from the front row with a warm, deeply satisfied smile. His unconventional, risky experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His son had finally found a love that could not be bought with millions, a love that saw the true value of a man's soul rather than the size of his estate. They had built a beautiful, unbreakable paradise right in the middle of a status-obsessed world, proving that when two pure hearts connect, no amount of social inequality or deceptive trials can ever tear them apart. My wonderful and deeply valued viewers, this powerful, emotional journey leaves us with an incredibly profound philosophical conclusion that we must all carry deep within our hearts. And in a modern society that is so thoroughly obsessed with material wealth, expensive luxury, and superficial social status, we far too often forget that the most valuable things in human existence are completely invisible to the eye. True, authentic love is absolutely not about the thickness of a person's bank account, the luxury of the car they drive, or the neighborhood where they sleep. It is entirely about seeing the raw, unpolished beauty of someone's heart and actively choosing to stay through the dirt, the struggles, and the storms. Wealth can disappear in a single flash of economic lightning. Luxury can fade into nothingness, but a fiercely loyal, pure, and incorruptible soul is a rare, eternal treasure that time can never destroy. Life will always test your heart, and karma will always return exactly what you sow into the universe. If you act with greed and cruelty like Mr. Omari, you will ultimately reap destruction. But if you love with absolute sincerity, selflessness, and integrity like Tama, you will inherit a kingdom of pure, everlasting peace. What do you think about this deeply emotional story? Do you believe Tama did the absolute right thing by forgiving Dezebo after his massive test? Have you ever experienced a test of loyalty in your own life? Please share your beautiful thoughts, personal experiences, and opinions in the comment section below. I would truly love to read every single one of them. A far more interesting, intriguing, and highly instructive story will be coming your way in just a few days, so make sure you smash that subscribe button, hit the like video button, and turn on the notification bell so you absolutely never miss a single upload. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the powerful lesson of true love. Thank you so much for watching, stay blessed, and we will see you in the next video.